Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and move on to our Best Picture movie series. If you're just joining us, welcome to 1967. You're a little late in the decade,
Well,
but
you're
still love
joining
that
at a
you're
good
here.
time, folks, because this is when things shifted for American cinema.
Yes, for sure. And we'll certainly get into that as we begin the review. But yes, we are covering the 1960s. If you missed any of the previous conversations on The Apartment, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia, Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, and A Man for All Seasons, we have covered those films over the last few weeks. It was a great
Hmm.
time. And we have three more films to cover for the decade. In the heat of the night, 1967, this film was nominated up against Bonnie and Clyde, Dr. Dolittle, The Graduate, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. As we noted up at the very top of the show, Sidney Poitier, obviously in two of those movies, even though he wasn't nominated at all for either one of those films.
We've got thoughts, or at least I've got thoughts.
And look, maybe it's indicative of the Academy and the tensions of the time. Maybe it was all extremely meta. I don't know.
Hmm.
But wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me. At any rate, we'll talk about In the Heat of the Night. It is a fascinating winner given
Yeah,
1967, even if maybe it doesn't quite hold up historically. I do think when it comes to this year, I'm just talking cultural zeitgeist. Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, probably have more of a pull there. Maybe even Guess Who's Coming to
probably,
Dinner. Yeah,
probably.
well,
Yeah, I think those two, yeah,
definitely,
definitely have more of a pull for sure. But
absolutely. But in the heat
yeah,
of the night, I like it's not like a quiet winner. Like it's not buried. Like The Graduate and
no,
Bonnie and Clyde have certainly taken the zeitgeist more of a hold. But in the heat of the night has simmered. It hasn't disappeared. To be fair,
yeah, there is another reason for that I'm sure we'll talk about. But you're not wrong that there is still a bit of a reputation that this movie carries.
for sure. Okay, with all of that laid out, you ready to get into this?
Yeah, let's talk about the night.
Let's talk about
It's a hot
the
one,
heat,
the
the
hot
heat
one.
of the night, the hot ones. Yeah, this was the hot ones of its day. It is directed by Norman Jewison, and it stars Sidney Poitier, Rod Steiger, Warren Oates, Lee Grant, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with In the Heat of the Night, a black Philadelphia police detective is mistakenly suspected of a local murder while passing through a racially hostile Mississippi town, and after being cleared, is reluctantly asked by the police chief, the Philadelphia police chief, as well
Hmm.
as the local one, to investigate the case. All right, Brendan, what did you think about In the Heat of the Night with
Well, I think
Sidney
it's
Poitier?
yeah, the Sidney Poitier extravaganza because he was in this as well as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner that same year, both nominated for Best Picture, and neither of them
Mhm.
he was nominated for acting, which is just kind of astounding, but I think speaks volumes as to how the Academy functioned politically and corporately by allowing a movie like this to win, but not give the right talent their due. I think that certainly speaks volumes and why it is such a fascinating winner. First off, was this a first time watch for you, or had you seen this one before?
No, I had seen it, but
Okay.
like we've discussed with some of these others, it was back in college sometime. So it
Okay.
had been about 20 years. God, I'm getting so
Well,
old.
I know, me
It,
too.
it, it's been close to that.
Yeah. Well, I bring that question up because I think this actually was a first time watch for me. I thought I
Okay.
had seen it before, but perhaps I was just simply confusing it with the television series from the late 80s into the
Mhm.
90s, which I think is ultimately why this film has a bit of a reputation because it did spawn a pretty successful TV series that went
Yes.
on for, I think, 150 episodes almost for quite some time. I mean, it went from 1988 to 1995. So it was certainly a popular series. And I think I may have just simply confused my experience, maybe watching some aspects of that show with this movie because I didn't really recognize anything watching it again, even if I had seen it before in preparation for this discussion. So it made for a very fresh perspective. and a very interesting one coming off the heels of many of these other Best Picture winners. And you sort of alluded to this online already, Judy, when you posted your thoughts on social media. But there is a clear breaking point between the Hollywood of old and the Hollywood of new in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And when we talked about A Man from All Seasons on last week's show, which won Best Picture in 1966, I talked about how there was sort like it still carried those usual tropes of historical epics of Hollywood back in the day, but it sort of alluded to the griminess and the grittiness that we would see in the American New Wave. But now we're here. Now we're here in the American New Wave. We have jumped the shark into the American New Wave. And that is all over in the heat of the night. And it wasn't just this movie. I mean, that sort of tactility that we saw in many movies of the time that really defined the American New Wave, that existed in some of this film's other fellow Best Picture nominees. Bonnie and Clyde, it was all over that.
Yeah.
It was all over
Yeah.
The Graduate and Mike Nichols' use of experimentation there. Like, that's really in many ways what I think the theme of 1967 was when you look at these 5 movies all nominated for Best Picture. Maybe, the exception being Dr. Dolittle, but we don't have time to even bother talking about that one.
yeah, exactly.
But I think that all together, that's why I think In the Heat of the Night is a very fascinating Best Picture winner. Certainly a timely story, and maybe frighteningly more timely now, as I'm sure we'll talk about. I don't think it's a great movie. I think by comparison to some of the other films it was nominated against, especially films that were sort of embracing this new American New Wave and this new style of filmmaking, I think In the Heat of the Night is a much flimsier film when compared to something like The Graduate or Bonnie and Clyde. In fact, I think in a way I might even still take Stanley Kramer's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner over this one, just because I tend to prefer the domesticity of that one. But I think what makes In the Heat of the Night a very powerful one really does come down to Sidney Poitier's performance. I know Rod Steiger was the one nominated here, and I do like their banter. I like their chemistry.
Mhm.
But Sidney Poitier brings something to this movie that actually makes it an emotional experience. And without his performance, I'm not sure how much the film would have held up for me. But I do think it's a pretty good one. I just think as a filmmaking exercise, when compared to some of these other films, I think it's a little choppier. I think it almost seems to allude to the early stages of the American New Wave before it really found its footing. But I think as a story, it's certainly a powerful one.
Yeah, I do think this is a good movie. I do really like it. And as you alluded to, I think one of the great things about doing a series like this is that it gives you a historical perspective and context to the shifting cinematic landscape. We are, of course, going through the 60s, and this film, as you eloquently articulated, it is an immediate right turn into something completely different.
Yeah.
1967 was a pivotal year for American cinema, so it was inevitably going to be a significant change no matter who won Best Picture. Well, outside of one, as you noted, but generally speaking, it was going to be jarring given the trajectory of the 60s to this point.
Right.
Now, with Oliver winning the next year, that would ironically go back to old Hollywood for a brief second. But then
for
it would
a very
continue.
brief second. And then, of course,
It would
Midnight Cowboy
continue.
being maybe even the most extreme example of that.
Yeah, it would continue the new trajectory set by this film.
If anything, the 60s, the late 60s especially, showcase what we call the pendulum effect, and how the Academy likes to honor the right movie and then the wrong movie, and then the right movie and then the wrong movie. And we certainly see that with the late 60s here.
Yeah, but it was a brief caveat because once you get to Midnight Cowboy and then into the 70s, we are full bore into New Hollywood. So it's just a funny little hiccup more than anything else.
It is.
But it is clear that this new trajectory was set by In the Heat of the Night. Say what you will about the film and its politics. And look, I don't think it's unfair to criticize it for its broad liberalism, especially through the lens of 2025, which, to be fair, has been a major talking point that we've had in this series, especially in recent weeks. But I think we have to consider two things in this regard. The context of 1967 is really important here.
Yeah.
racial tensions at that time were obviously extremely high. They had to film this in Illinois because they were afraid that something legit might happen to Poitier. And
Yeah.
even when they had to go to Tennessee for the plantation scenes, he slept with a gun under his pillow. Studio
Hmm.
executives were genuinely concerned that theaters in the South may see violence and uproar when the film was released. You're just a few years removed from the Civil Rights Bill being passed in Congress. That same year, you had the violent Detroit riots in Detroit. So I think you can equally argue that given the time, there is a provocative quality to this film.
Absolutely.
Then you look at the screenplay here, and I think the script does a really great job of finding nuances in the details. For
Hmm.
example, I love that the initial rage from Gillespie and Wood, the sheriff and one of his cronies,
Yeah.
it isn't just that they booked the wrong guy, but it turns out that he's a smarter cop and is well paid more than they are.
He's a better cop. Yeah.
He's
And they take offense to that.
better and better paid.
Yeah.
There's also the moment where Tibbs finds Wood in this lie near the end of the film because he has, speaking of Tibbs, he has information that came from when he was wrongfully booked,
Yeah.
ensuring that Tibbs is always two steps ahead of these other police officers. I think the film does a great job of turning every little interaction that in the hands of another writer and director would just be simple police procedural interactions. But
Sure.
here they are littered with rigorous hostility and prejudice that tapped into the ethos of 1967. And
Hmm.
ultimately, that's what defines this film more than the whodunit mystery that drives its plotting. And I think through that prism, there was a lot for me to enjoy with this film in a
Yeah.
vacuum on its
Yeah.
own terms, but especially through that historical prism, it
Hmm.
does give weight to just how prominent this film was. And I
Hmm.
don't know if it can be overstated. I mean, we'll talk more about it as we go in Portier's performance, and I agree with you, he should have been nominated. But who he is here, this performance, the role, even unprecedented for the time, especially
Yeah.
there, that has to be considered with something like In the Heat of the Night. That is maybe lost a little bit today, although obviously we're always having these conversations today. But I
Hmm.
don't think it can be overstated how vital that was in 1967.
It was a very dangerous movie in some ways. And Sidney Poitier himself actually insisted that this film be shot in the North because there was a time that he and Harry Belafonte were almost killed by KKK members when they visited Mississippi. So it just goes to show how dangerous the film was to simply make and the danger that Sidney Poitier was putting himself in just to be in a movie like this.
Mm,
And the fact that he is the one that's not nominated, but Rod Steiger is. And he's good in the movie, don't get me wrong. Um, but really, it is the movie's uh, good graces are born out of Sidney Poitier's performance. I think he really is the glue that holds this movie together, as well as the screenplay. You know, I'm glad you brought up the screenplay here from Sterling Silliphant, I believe the writer's name is. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But I do think that's where any nuance here is. It really comes down to how the story is handled, how it almost deceptively puts this mystery up front when the movie really isn't about that at all. It's about other things. And I think from a writing standpoint, the film does a good job balancing those things. I
yeah.
think as a murder mystery, I'll just come out and say, I think it actually wraps itself up very anticlimactically. I don't think the murder mystery itself wraps itself up in a convincing way at all. But thankfully, the movie's not really about that. It has more on its
Yeah.
mind and actually leads to a
I
more
agree.
tender conclusion between two characters that showcase that this movie was about something else entirely, that it almost makes the mystery itself kind of moot. So I do think the script is another one of the strongest points that really makes this
Yeah.
movie such a worthwhile historical relic. I don't think it was the best of the
Yeah.
nominees here, as I mentioned. But I, in a way, I'm kind of glad a movie like this won Best Picture because that makes it more of an
Yeah.
interesting one to study in the context of where
Yeah.
Hollywood was going.
Well, and that's a conversation, a debate I feel like we have often.
Hmm.
Do you vote for the best film of the year, or are we voting for the film that might define the year the most? And sometimes
Hmm.
those are two totally different movies.
Yeah, and
Sometimes they're the same.
it's hard to predict that at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, because who knew that a movie like The Graduate would be really the defining movie of this year in a very different way, but like from a filmmaking way, as far as just the critical basis of it and the fact that it has become such a classic. The
Yeah.
Graduate is everyone knows that movie. Everyone knows Mrs. Robinson now.
Yeah. But I don't think it's the defining film of that year, though. I don't think it's
That's
the
fair.
defining film of the culture. And that's what I'm trying to point out
That's
here.
fair. That's fair.
Sometimes they are two totally different things. Something like The Graduate is defining from a film perspective of 1967, absolutely.
Hmm.
But it's not defining of where America was at that time.
That's fair. Yeah.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, and why I do think you have to consider the historical context. Sidney Poitier's Virgil Tibbs character was revolutionary for American cinema. He's
Hmm.
this black man portrayed as a professional. He is highly competent. He's emotionally restrained. He's morally grounded. He is not the sidekick character. He's not comic relief. He's not some sort of subordinate. He is the smartest person in the room at any
Hmm.
given time. And he is the moral center of the film.
Yeah.
That had never been done before until this film came out in 1967. His character demanded respect and an environment that was nothing but hostile toward him. And he's not really seeking acceptance throughout this film. He's not trying
Hmm.
to fit in. He is challenging them at every turn, right? That's why the line, "They call me Mr. Tibbs," was and is still so impactful, because
Yeah.
it challenges Southern customs where black men were often addressed dismissively as something like boy, which they do
Hmm.
call him throughout this film, boy, son. That's
Yeah.
how they address him. They don't call him Mr. Tibbs. There's no respect toward them. So that moment when it comes, "They call me Mr. Tibbs," it was a bombshell. It was a
Yeah.
cultural landmine that set off and subverted tropes that still are felt today. Still felt today. So I agree with you. As a movie, there are problems here. There's
Hmm.
no doubt about it. I don't think that the ending of the film is all that sharp or incisive. And there are moments throughout, especially regarding the mystery of the film, that feel a little sloppy. I
Yeah.
just don't think that is at all what this film is about.
Yeah.
That is
There
nothing
are more
more than a
interesting things. Yeah.
cipher for the film's ideas and depictions of racism and prejudice, and how Tibbs is treated throughout the film. And
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
how there are, in every little moment, it is set up for some sort of bickering or challenging to take place. And in those details, that's where I find this film so fascinating,
Mhm.
especially in that context, the
Yeah.
context of 67.
And I know that we've talked about how almost unforgivable it was that Sidney Poitier wasn't nominated for this movie. Instead, Rod Steiger was. But I don't want to underplay Rod Steiger's performance either. I actually think he is also crucial in allowing those themes to work as well as they
Oh
do.
yeah, no, I
Because
agree.
Gillespie
Yeah.
really is the one that has the arc here, or at least the most noticeable arc.
Mm,
And I will say, and maybe this is due to Rod Steiger's performance more specifically, but the arc does have some complications to it and some nuances to it. It's not as simple as, oh, I don't accept this black man, and then now I do. You could tell that there are moments where he is not just thinking about his own prejudices, but he's also thinking about the safety of his small town, that they're not ready to embrace a man like this. So having him around is actually putting other people in danger. And I'm not saying that he's right or even wrong for necessarily thinking that, but it does raise some rightful conversations to be had that do have layers to them. And I think his performance and his arc do add some layers to the movie. So I think the
yeah.
banter between the two of them really is why the movie does work. I know you mentioned that the ending does kind of wrap itself up in a way that's a little sloppy, and I do agree, but I do like the scene between the two of them at the train station. That final
Yeah, oh, I
scene between the
agree.
two of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the mystery, not so much their relationship.
The way the mystery wraps up honestly makes no sense. Like
I agree.
there's no way for those characters to all of a sudden believe what Tibbs is saying. It's like, oh wait, maybe he's on something. Let's check this other guy's pocket or something.
Yeah.
Like
No,
there's
it's
no
ridiculous.
way it just does not make any sense whatsoever. The plotting of the mystery itself is certainly problematic. I didn't always love some of the directional choices by Norman Jewison, and maybe this is also just due to the early stages of the American New Wave starting to find its footing. So some of those blemishes are still kind of interesting. There's a moment early on when I forget who plays Gillespie's one. Officer Sam Wood, played by Warren Oates. He's the figure that we actually witness this story through at first. We see it from his perspective, and he's the one that discovers this body that becomes the center point for this mystery, this murder mystery. But when his car stops, the camera just stops and then all of a sudden zooms in on his back taillight for what feels like no reason. It's like they're really interesting, weird choices that the movie makes as a directional experience and editorial experience that really feel like the American New Wave trying to find its footing. It's
Yeah.
interesting. It's kind of weird and neat, but they don't really work when you look at it
Yeah.
nowadays. And I just want to call some of those things out that it makes the movie even more of an interesting relic for 1967.
Yeah, I didn't really mind that zoom in the moment because it is the beginning of the American New Wave, and I was
Mhm.
anticipating more of that throughout the
Sure.
film, but
Yeah.
then you don't really get much of that experimentation as the
Well,
film goes, so it does
that's a good
stand
point.
out.
I think that's why it doesn't work as well as something like Bonnie and Clyde from the same year, or even The Graduate. Those are films that were more confident in their experimentation. They were more consistent with that.
Yeah.
And this one seems to be kind of flirting with it a bit more, and it's not as consistent by comparison.
But on the same token, I don't think this is a film that necessarily calls for experimentation because the
Right.
screenplay is full of these powerful
Yeah.
nuances when it comes
That's
to
exactly.
Tibbs, what he's challenging, and that dynamic with Gillespie. That's what I really
Mm,
want to go back to is what you were saying about Gillespie and his
mm,
role here, because it is so fascinating. He is the chief of this town. There's clearly a prejudice that he shows toward Tibbs, and he has his biases. But as the film goes, while it's not it's not a tacky evolution that you get by the end. It's not that he comes around and all of a sudden he's no longer racist. It's nothing
yeah, it's not that
schmaltzy
simple.
like that. It's not that simple. But what I do love is that we just start to see cracks in the armor. And I
Yeah.
think what's brilliant about the film is that it suggests that individuals like Gillespie, they are simply shaped by their environment.
Mhm,
They are
mhm. Yeah.
products of the people around them and the culture and the systems around them.
Yeah.
Because Gillespie, the more he finds out about Tibbs, the more that he starts to open up to him a little bit. He does start to respect him. He does understand the pivotal role that Tibbs plays in this investigation. Even though he is reluctant at first, as I noted in my opening thoughts, I love that little detail that he is angry. He's obviously showing his prejudice toward him in those early interactions with how he treats him, what he
Yeah.
calls him.
Yeah.
But then he just gets so angry with him when he finds out that he's a detective that makes more money than he does, like way more money than he
Yeah.
does,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
which is hilarious. And I love how that comes through in the performance for sure.
Mhm.
And I love that the film doesn't rush this pseudo bonding that takes place by the end of the film. And again, why the mystery of this film, like it means so little to it.
Mhm.
I think of that scene between Tibbs and Gillespie near the end when they're just in Gillespie's home and he's drinking a little whiskey and they're having this cordial insightful conversation where they're trying to get to know each other a little bit more.
Yeah.
And you like that to me is what's defining of this film more than anything else. And I love how the film does treat Gillespie and his ignorance throughout this film, and how that starts to fade a little bit when he starts to realize that Tibbs isn't what people around him preach, but more so he's just a human being like he is. That they have more in common than they don't.
Yeah.
And that I find so compelling here in the interactions, in the writing, of course, but the performances as well, and that dynamic.
Yeah.
It is really, really great.
And yet their dynamic by the end of the movie still feels a little bit unresolved. It doesn't.
Oh, it's very
fully-
unresolved. It is ambiguous for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty ambiguous. You definitely can sense that they have found a little bit of respect for each other, more so than they had before. So there definitely was some
Yeah, for
growth
sure.
there. If anything, it's alluding to something that could be potentially positive for both communities and both of the two of them going forward. But one of the things I respect about the movie so much is, in any other year, if this were a big hit, we would get a sequel. We would get a sequel exploring these two characters even more so. In many ways, like
The
this
next
kind
one
of
would be a buddy cop movie.
I mean, in many ways, like this is kind of like the most serious version of a Lethal Weapon kind of dynamic. And
Sure,
here
yeah.
we've had 4 of them with I guess a 5th on the way.
Yeah.
But this is a movie that rightfully leaves its two characters kind of dangling a little bit, and I do
Yeah.
appreciate that. I know this did spawn a television show, like I said, but that was a very disconnected thing. It was inspired by this. It had a completely different cast and
Yeah.
allowed it to function as its own thing and not feel the need to resolve the ties and connections specifically related to this movie or these iterations of these characters. So I appreciate that this one does end in a rather ambiguous way, as if to kind of foreshadow where things could go for the better, but it doesn't.
Yeah,
It
yes.
doesn't necessarily confirm that.
Yes. And again, I love how that dynamic is constructed without ever really smoothing over the edges. I don't think it does that at all, because even in that moment when it's the two of them at Gillespie's house and they're sharing this moment, trying to get to know each other, and for the most part, it is this cordial moment where you do start to see that respect that they are finding for each other kind of creep out into the open a little bit. But even as that comes and we learn about both characters and their loneliness, that's something they talk about, and that we see none of, both are not married, they do this job, they're committed to the job, and they do expose the loneliness that they do have, that they start to share in that loneliness. And then there's a moment where Tibbs, I forget the exact line, but he says something like, "I'm lonely like you are." And Gillespie sort of loses it. Like, no, we're not the same.
Yeah.
We're not the same. I'm not defined by my loneliness.
Like,
So even when they're sharing a moment of bonding, there's still kind of this prickly dynamic. It's not exactly smoothed over, which is why it is ultimately ambiguous at the end of the film. You're just not going to lose your prejudice and racism in 40 years or however old Gillespie is. You're like, when you're shaped by your environment that deeply, that's just not going to evaporate overnight. But you start to see cracks in the armor. That's the great thing about their dynamic, but it's not necessarily something that Tibbs is out to do. Like, that's not his job here. It's just Gillespie learning that these people are not who his environment has told him that they are, if that makes sense. Like, that's where the cracks come in, and he just starts to see Tibbs and his humanity. And that's just because he is human. It's not because Tibbs is doing anything to provoke that.
Yeah.
It's just that he's starting to see the facade for what it is. Gillespie's starting to see the facade for what it is.
Yeah. He's sorry, keep going.
I was just going to say that's the brilliance of the writing and the performance, and why I could see where the Oscar nomination comes from, because it is really great how that starts to break through in the character, again, without being overly schmaltzy or anything to that sort, because I don't think it ever comes close to that territory.
No, I don't think it does either.
I do think it's still grounded. It of course gets a little comedic at times because it is a movie, so it's a little movie-ish.
Yeah, it's got to be a bit cinematic.
Yes, exactly. But I think on the whole, the film does a great job of maintaining the grounded quality and the seriousness of the themes they're dealing with.
Yeah, we have to correct ourselves a little bit. We keep alluding to Rod Steiger and his Oscar nomination. No, it was an Oscar win. He actually won for this
Oscar
movie.
win. Yes.
Yeah, so he didn't just get nominated; he won for this movie.
He
So
won.
we should make sure that
Yeah.
we've done our homework here. But what I do think is interesting about the movie as well, and I don't know if this was a deliberate choice or if this just happened by accident, because this movie doesn't suggest that this small town in Mississippi is now all of a sudden changed because of the events on screen. In
Yeah.
fact, there's a good chance that the majority of the people that
It's
live in this town
yeah.
haven't changed at all,
No,
including
it's
the
quite the
police.
opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. But the one other character that does showcase the cracks in the system a little bit is ironically a woman. And that's the character of Mrs. Colbert, played by Lee Grant, who is the
Mhm.
wife of the victim at play that centers this whole mystery. At one point, she even calls attention to this police force, given the whole racial dynamics of it all, asking like what kind of place are you guys running here anyway? I just want to know
Yeah.
who killed my husband. And she raises a great point,
Yeah.
and really kind of maybe inadvertently demonstrates that there are cracks in the system that need to be corrected. But I kind of like that, maybe cryptically, the only other character that seems to recognize that is a woman. So maybe the film is
Yeah.
suggesting something else that's a bit, politically relevant
Yeah.
nowadays as well. I'm not sure if that was the intent, but that's pretty
Yeah.
interesting, I think. So
Yeah.
I at least give the film credit for being a little ahead of the curve there too.
No, I agree. I think what's great about that character is that she gives credence to Tibbs and what he is trying to expose within
Hmm.
this police department, right? It's
Hmm.
one thing when you have a one-on-one dynamic with Tibbs and Gillespie and they're going
Yeah.
head to head as we've been talking about, but once he hears Mrs. Colbert, evoke a similar thing that Tibbs has been trying to expose, it does kind of open his eyes a little bit more. So, as small of a role as she plays, it is quite pivotal
Yeah.
in many regards. And you do start to see Gillespie realize that it's not about him and his prejudices, it's not about getting it wrong, but rather we do need to care for her emotional needs in the moment, so let's do the right thing.
Hmm.
And I do love how that does play a role here.
Yeah.
I do agree. And it kind of widens a little bit further the gap between, like, the intellectual gap between Tibbs and Gillespie as well,
Yeah.
because at every turn he is always doing the wrong thing, putting the wrong person in prison. He
Yeah.
goes after Sam later on in the film, and Tibbs is always there 2 steps ahead of him to be like, no, like you're pointing yourself down the wrong path here.
Hmm.
And what I love about the screenplay is the antithesis happens at one point as well with Tibbs, where he gets personal with his conviction and who he thinks done it because of how he's being treated. So the film does kind of flip that coin a little bit, even with Tibbs, as smart and
I was
sophisticated
just
as
gonna
he
say
is
that.
here.
Yeah. Yeah, he does put his own prejudices ahead of his intellectual mystery solving, at least for one moment, thinking that the man that they're after is Endicott, just because they had a
Yeah.
very specific exchange at one point in the film.
Yeah. Which again is crucial, right? The
Yeah.
slap heard around the world. That is such a vital moment in this film. Again, going back to the historical context
That kinda
of
took me
this
by
movie.
surprise. Yeah. I wasn't
Yeah,
ready for that even watching it now.
absolutely. It would have been extremely rare to see, especially in a major Hollywood movie, to see a black man stand up to a white authority figure like that and then
Yeah.
viciously slap him back the way he does.
Yeah,
It's
seriously.
electrifying, quite cathartic, I'm sure, for a lot of people watching this in 1968.
Uh-huh.
An incredible moment in this film, for
Wonder if
sure.
that probably led to some gasps in the theater.
Yeah, I mean, that might be the only time in the film where it gets slightly schmaltzy, but given the symbolism of it, I'm
Yeah.
very much okay with it. But it is a moment where Tibbs stands up to this white authoritarian figure that, as we come to learn, he essentially runs everything in this town. slaps him
Mhm.
back, and then you get this slow pan in on him as he starts to cry over the slap. Endicott, that is. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
wow, okay. Maybe a little heavy handed there. But again, given the context of the time, it still comes off quite powerful.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
but it
I
is an
yeah,
interesting moment.
I do wonder, and this is not a knock on the movie, because when we review movies like this that spoke to a certain cultural thing at the time that they came out, you kind of have to look at it through the eyes of how people viewed it at that time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But if this exact movie came out today, I wonder how people would react to it. I don't think it's quite at the level of, let's say, a Green Book and how it oversimplifies its racial politics. I don't think it's quite
Mhm.
that simplified, but I think it could dangerously come close. But I think in
At
the
times,
context of
for sure.
yeah, but I think in the context of 1967, that's why we're calling this movie fairly provocative for what it's doing. It certainly doesn't have that same level of provocation nowadays if it were to come out nowadays in this exact way. But I
Uh-huh.
think in 1967, it's certainly an intriguing one.
Well, I think where it differs from something like a Green Book, and I will hold to this. That's why I think this film is still quite good, even in a vacuum.
Hmm.
It's not the best of 1967. I don't disagree there. But given this film, and even through a 2025 lens, I don't think it quite has the Green Book thing where it is smoothed over. Like that is a film that is completely smoothed over.
Yeah, that one
And
is it's so devoid of conflict, even if there is conflict in
yes,
the movie. It's
a-
it's not wrestling with what it
absolutely.
wants to, address. This one at least has it on its mind.
Yeah. I mean, something like Green Book, Driving Miss Daisy, those are movies that at the end of it go, look, we've solved racism. It's over, guys. It's done. We've solved it.
That's fair.
Shouldn't
That's
you all
fair.
be thankful to us? We have solved racism. That is the ethos of those movies. This
Mhm.
is a film that doesn't care to solve racism. It is not attempting to solve racism.
Sure.
And that's the brilliance of the Tibbs Gillespie dynamic, as we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yeah,
That
I agree.
relationship, it is ambiguous, it is still rough around the edges, and Gillespie's evolution isn't defined by Tibbs going out of his way to be an angel to Gillespie. That is not what
Right.
this film is.
Right.
Throughout this film, and this is why Sidney Poitier's performance is really great because he's very consistent,
Yeah.
perhaps stoic even, and I say
Mhm.
that very complimentary.
Oh, absolutely.
He
Yeah.
he is who he is throughout this whole film. He does not change. He does not evolve. He is the smartest man in the room at any given time.
Yeah.
And while there are times he wants to leave this situation because of how they treat him, and no one would
Who
blame
could
him
blame
for
him? Yeah.
that, but there's some sort of conviction about being a police officer, a detective, an expert, even a homicide expert. They call him throughout this film,
Mhm.
and that conviction brings him back to the investigation, and again in this very hostile environment, and he is always who he is. So the changes of the other characters here, particularly Gless, because he does have the biggest change, but it's
Mhm.
not a 180 by any stretch of the imagination. All his whole change here is simply removing the facade of the Mississippi environment in which he grew up in.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
starts to see these little cracks because he starts to see Tibbs as a human.
Yeah.
He starts to see how feeble those lessons, like growing up in Mississippi, the lessons he
Ye
learned. Like
and
that's
yeah,
it.
and you get
That
the sense that Gillespie has probably never been anywhere else in the world.
yeah.
They're like this whole, like, fish out of water
Yeah,
kind
for
of thing
sure.
that happens here is definitely adding to that component as
Yeah.
well.
And if the film is arguing anything, that is it. It is not trying to
Mhm.
solve racism. It is simply trying to say that you are a product of your environment. If you get out of that environment, there might be a path forward for you that starts to remove that facade a little bit. That's all it's
Mhm.
saying. It's not trying to solve anything. If anything, it's just trying to solve who murdered this guy, and it does that
It does that
Not
pretty
the greatest.
sloppily.
Yeah, not the greatest. Not the greatest. So like I would argue this is a far cry from those movies.
I
Even
think
if it
that's a fair
came out
point.
today.
I think it's a fair point. There's definitely more nuance there, which
Yeah.
does give it a bit of an edge. Maybe not as much of an edge now than it does then, but it's just an interesting conversation to have to showcase how different times that we're in and how different that it was then. But seeing this through the prism of 1967 really makes for an interesting conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And look, I would have voted for Bonnie and Clyde over this. I would have voted for The Graduate over this. Hell, I would have voted for Cool Hand Luke over this.
Gosh,
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? I think is probably a smoother movie as well.
Yeah, I like that movie slightly more just as a movie. Yeah. I think it's a smoother experience.
Totally fair. That's also really, really good. Yeah. And funny enough, Katharine Hepburn won for Best Actress for that film. So Poitier,
I guess these movies were alluding to something dirty in the Hollywood underbelly. My goodness.
Again, so there's a meta component there, right, where he's left out of all of this.
Yeah,
in a year where racial tensions are very high.
Well, interestingly, they being the Academy, they give the awards to the white characters,
the white counterparts
that actually had the arc, that actually learned more of the lesson, right? So they're failing to look at how their black counterparts were actually the ones that made them they made themselves challenge those notions in the first place, and how important that they were for that conversation.
Well, the Academy, broadly speaking, even today, still struggles with subtle performances or stoic performances. They still do. It's very rare. Very rare.
It's very rare that you get a Casey Affleck or something like that.
Casey Affleck, a Paul Mescal for After Sun. Every now and then they do infiltrate their way through, but it's very rare. Even today, that is still an issue with the Academy when it comes to performances. So I'm not too surprised by that. But given the context of 67, as we've been talking about, it does make In the Heat of the Night and Sidney Poitier, him being left out, it does add some tragic volumes.
But yeah, you're right. We don't often see the stoic or quieter performance going on to win the Oscar. We've seen it a few times. I mentioned Casey Affleck, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, I almost feel like we could count Cillian Murphy in that conversation. I mean, say what you will about. I mean, it's not a stoic movie. Oppenheimer is not a stoic movie. But he's kind of giving a stoic performance in that movie. I mean, he doesn't have the Oscar moment that they like to, you know, add as a clip to showcase why they're winning an Oscar that night.
Yeah. And if there is a clip, it's the gymnasium scene where he says almost nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. But then again, that's that's the lack of stoicism in the movie, not the performance.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I agree. But that is to say, In the Heat of the Night, I agree it's not the best film of 67. There are others I would personally vote for it.
Yeah.
But I don't think there was another film more defining of the year from an American social political context.
Yeah, and I think
The Heat of the Night is more defining than anything else that came out that year, and it's not particularly close. Which is why I still think this is a fascinating winner. I still think it's a fascinating winner, and on its own terms, I will also go to bat for it for all the reasons that we just said.
I don't disagree with that.
I think it's real good. And again, I want to, as much as I criticize some of the sloppy writing when it comes to the mystery, I think the strength of the screenplay is in the characters, those like the interaction between the characters and how it creates this hostility throughout the film. There's always these bursts of hostility between Tibbs and whoever he's interacting with, which I think is really, really great. The film just doesn't care about its mystery. That's its biggest problem.
Yeah.
Just doesn't care. Everything that happens at the end of the film regarding the mystery, that whole night scene.
It's such an afterthought.
I couldn't tell you anything that happens there. It is so baffling. It is strange.
It's not that it's, hard to decipher, even hard to follow. It's not that complicated. The problem is that it just makes no sense from a character revealing standpoint. It
Well,
feels like the movie needs to wrap itself up, and it had no idea how to do it.
well, I would argue it is kind of sloppy.
Well,
Like
okay,
I
it's
don't
sloppy,
even know
but
what happened until I went to look it up out.
oh, see,
Like
okay,
who gave who? Like I think it's very confused. Like I
see,
don't think it reveals what happens there with any cogency. I think it is very muddled. And in
yeah,
addition to what
okay,
you're saying, in
yeah.
addition to what you're saying.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily find it confusing. I was still able to follow it. For me, it's just it's how certain character reveals wrap up. There's no way that this group of people would listen to Tibbs when he actually reveals, hey, this one was going to get abortion for this reason. Check her pocket. She's got it in there. Like, oh, wait, maybe he's onto something. Let's listen to him. There's no way they would do that. Absolutely no way. It just defies character logic completely.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's part of why I find it confounding there. Like how
Oh,
she
sure. Yeah.
has the money or where that money comes from, why that is important. Like the film doesn't really give that away, but it's kind of important. Like you have to
Well,
really infer
it's
certain things.
it's there, but it's the lack of importance and the lack of emphasis on that makes it feel like an afterthought when it shouldn't.
Yeah. It's real strange. But
Mhm.
I do want to give the film, I guess, a little bit of credit because it's trying to subvert what looks to be the obvious thing.
Sure.
And by doing that, as we noted earlier, it does give some flaws to even Detective Tibbs and his logic and his thinking throughout the film.
Sure.
And it gives him a reason to realize that he has his own biases that he can get trapped in at times. Which I think is
Yeah.
revealing.
I think that's interesting. Makes for a good talking
I
point.
agree. The unfortunate side effect of that is the murderer is not
yeah.
going. It's going to be someone completely different.
Yeah.
And how do you get to that point?
Yeah.
Well, it struggles. The film struggles there, but at the same time, again, I can forgive it because it's like 20th on the list of the most important things to this film.
There's
and
more
what it's
important
trying
things
to
for
do.
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I do like it.
It's a solid
I-
movie.
I really liked it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Certainly not among the best that we've talked about in this series. It's certainly better than My Fair Lady, and it's also I'd also take it over Tom Jones. But I think of those that we've talked about, it's above those two, but I don't think it's above anything else. But then again, most of the movies we talked about in this series have been quite strong, so it's in good company.
I mean, it's been a hell of a decade. I agree.
Yeah,
I mean, at the end of it, I mean, we'll see next week because I don't believe I've seen Oliver, so that'll be a first
time
watch
for me as well. Yeah,
but worst case, it'll end up 8th on this list for me in the heat of the night. And I'm a defender. I've been defending this movie throughout this whole conversation, but it's been such a strong decade.
Yeah. There are other good qualities with this movie in the heat of the night specifically that we haven't even acknowledged yet, like the music. Quincy Jones, the great Quincy Jones.
Yeah.
The editing, which I didn't really love the editing here, but the editing was from Hal Ashby, who actually won Best Film Editing for this movie. But he would go on to be the director of films like Harold and Maude and The Last Detail and Shampoo and Being There. So just kind of an interesting, career shift there. But I just thought that was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, in the heat of the night gets that great distinction that not a lot of Best Picture winners have.
Yeah,
and with its importance, it's not the best movie that came out in 1967, but it was one of the most important.
Sure,
revolutionary, and that again, that cannot be overstated, which makes it a quality winner in my mind still.
Yeah, and I think that's fair.
Still because of that.
That's fair.
All right. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hit us up. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com, but we would love to hear from you.